Again, my name is Kara Burke. I am a pharmacist in the Division of Drug Information, and I would like to welcome you to this live webinar sponsored by the FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, Office of Communications, Division of Drug Information. Today's webinar is titled FDA Drug Topics, an overview of FDA's Expanded Access Program with a focus on individual patient expanded access. Before I introduce our speaker, I have a few housekeeping remarks. All faculty are expected to use generic names. If trade names are used, those of several companies should be used rather than only that of a single supporting company. Unapproved use disclosure. CE faculty and speakers are required to disclose to the attendees when products or procedures being discussed are off-labeled or unlabeled, not FDA approved, and any limitations on the information that is presented. Disclosure. The faculty's planning committee members and the FDA CE consultation and accreditation team have nothing to disclose except the following. Dr. Edward Weinstein, Medical Officer in FDA's Division of Anti-Infective Products, discloses the following. Spouse receives salary from Endo Center of Baltimore as an employee. All inquiries for information relating to our webinars should be directed to our email address, ddiwebinars@fda.hhs.gov. Please note, the slides and presentation for this webinar will be archived and will be available later this week on our webpage at www.fda.gov/DDI-webinars. Both the presentation portion and the Q&A session will be recorded. If you have questions, please type them into the Q&A box on your screen. There will be time at the end of the webinar for the presenters to answer as many questions as time allows. We hope you'll enjoy meeting our presenters today. First, Deborah Miller, PhD, RN, is a Health Programs Coordinator for the Office of Health and Constituent Affairs in the Office of the Commissioner. She joined the FDA in 2008 to work with the FDA Oncology Patient Representative Program, responding to stakeholder inquiries regarding clinical trials, expanded access, personal importation, the development of Form FDA 3926, and other regulatory issues. She has a BS in Nursing and a BA in Economics from the University of Maryland, and a Master's of Public Health, Master's of Science of Nursing, and a PhD in Public Health Economics from Johns Hopkins University. Our second speaker, Lieutenant Commander Lindsay Wagner, is a team leader in FDA's Division of Drug Information, where she provides training and support to other pharmacists, drug information specialists, students, and fellows, and leads DDI's Expanded Access Program. Lieutenant Commander Wagner received her PharmD degree from the Albany College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences and went on to complete a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship specializing in drug information with experiences in academia, pharmaceutical industry, and FDA. And our third speaker, Colleen LaCicero, RPH, is the Associate Director for Regulatory Affairs in the Office of Drug Evaluation 1 in Cedar. Ms. LaCicero joined the FDA in 1998 as a project manager in the Division of Cardiovascular and Renal Drug Products, and in 2002 became the Associate Director for Regulatory Affairs in that office. Colleen worked on the development of the expanded access proposed and final rules and works on FDA expanded access policy and procedural documents. Now I will turn over the presentation to Deb Miller.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Kara. I will be presenting about FDA's Expanded Access Program. First, what is Expanded Access? Expanded Access is a process or pathway regulated by the Food and Drug Administration that allows manufacturers to provide investigational drugs to patients with serious diseases or conditions who have exhausted approved therapy and cannot participate in a clinical trial. Use of an investigational drug through expanded access is to treat, diagnose, or monitor a patient. This is different from the use of an investigational drug in a clinical trial, where the primary intent is research, that is, to learn about the safety and effectiveness of the drug. There are many terms used for FDA's Expanded Access Program, including an Individual Patient Investigational New Drug, IND. Many patients refer to the program as compassionate use. There is a hierarchy of access to therapies. Approved drugs are usually the first choice for treatment. Safety and effectiveness data are on the drug's label, and there is usually third-party reimbursement. Approved drugs have the broadest availability. If a patient has not adequately responded to approved drugs, the next option is participation in a clinical trial. A clinical trial is the most efficient path to market and availability. Finally, if a patient has a serious disease or condition, has exhausted approved therapies, and cannot participate in a clinical trial, then expanded access is an option, the option of last resort for treatment. The Expanded Access Program is described in 21 Code of Federal Regulations 312, Subpart I. See the link below to Subpart I. There are three categories of expanded access: individual, intermediate-sized population, and treatment. This webinar is focusing on the individual IND, but I will briefly describe treatment and intermediate-sized population programs. The general criteria for all three categories of expanded access, as well as additional criteria for each access category, are listed in the regulations. Requirements for submission and safeguards are also listed in the regulations. Safeguards are patient protections and include informed consent, ethics review, and reporting requirements. All expanded access programs have the following requirements. Patient has a serious or immediately life-threatening illness or condition. There is no comparable or satisfactory alternative therapy. The potential benefit justifies the potential risks of the treatment, and those risks are not unreasonable in the context of the disease or condition being treated. And providing the drug through expanded access will not interfere with or compromise the development of the drug. Now I will describe the three categories of expanded access. First, the treatment expanded access program. The treatment program is used when the drug is being investigated in a clinical trial designed to support marketing or trials are complete, or the company is actively pursuing marketing approval. The treatment protocol is not intended to provide long-term open-ended access, but rather to bridge the period between completion or near completion of development and approval of the drug. The intermediate-sized population IND has no fixed numerical requirement. It's more than one patient and generally less than a lot. It can be used when a drug is being developed, but patients are not eligible for the trial. The drug is not being developed, such as for rare disease, or if recruitment is not possible. Or the drug is approved, but has been withdrawn, or there is a drug shortage situation, and a foreign version of the U.S. drug is used. The sponsor can be a physician, manufacturer, or third party, such as a patient advocacy organization. For the patient IND, the physician must determine if probable risk from the drug does not exceed that from the disease. FDA must determine that the patient cannot obtain access under another type of IND. FDA takes expanded access applications seriously, and although the regulations allow FDA 30 days to process an application, FDA usually responds sooner. There are also procedures for emergency use, and that is where there's not time to make a written IND submission. FDA may authorize starting access without a written submission with a very quick turnaround. A follow-up written submission is required within 15 working days of authorization. For an individual patient IND, the physician often takes the role of sponsor investigator and is responsible for sponsor activities such as tracking and reporting. FDA requires a written summary report and may require special monitoring. FDA may request consolidation of multiple cases into a single intermediate-sized population IND. Human subject protections apply to all expanded access programs. Drugs in expanded access programs are investigational drugs, and they are subject to the following requirements: protection of human subjects, such as informed consent, institutional review boards for an ethics review, clinical holds for safety, and reporting requirements such as adverse event reports and annual reports. There are overarching considerations before allowing expanded access to proceed. There are unknown risks associated with access to investigational products for which there is limited information about safety and effectiveness. It cannot be predicted who may benefit, who may not benefit, or who may be harmed. The FDA considers the potential harm to patients, the need to exhaust all existing approved treatments, and the scientific likelihood of an efficacious response. There are potential expanded access program benefits. It can provide access to patients, including children, with serious or life-threatening diseases who have no other alternatives and are willing to accept greater risk. It can provide patients a measure of autonomy over their own healthcare decisions. And the treatment protocol can help bridge the gap between the latter stages of product development and approval by making a drug widely available during that time. It can provide hope to the patients and families. How do patients view risk? This is an important question. Patients often overestimate potential benefit and/or underestimate potential risk. New drugs can have toxicities that can cause increased suffering and pain, or the acceleration or prolonging of death with no increase in quality of life. These risks are not always considered by patients or families. Many patients and families think that the investigational drug is their hope for a cure. They often see risks as abstract. There are concerns about how trial enrollment may be affected by expanded access programs. Early access to investigational therapies could make phase 2 and 3 clinical trials more difficult to perform. Clinical trial enrollment and conduct are factors in consideration of treatment access to experimental drugs by manufacturers and FDA. Companies may deny a request for a number of reasons, such as there are available clinical trials for the patient, and the manufacturing capacity is often limited in early phases, and diverting the drug for expanded access could limit supply for trials. This is a graph that depicts the number of expanded access submissions for drugs in biologics to FDA from fiscal year 2010 to fiscal year 2016. Fiscal year 2017 data should soon be available on FDA's expanded access website at the link at the bottom of the slide. The y-axis is the number of expanded access IND submissions. The x-axis is the fiscal year for each category of expanded access, including single patient emergency IND submissions. The number at the top of each bar is the number of FDA denials. From the graph, you can see that most expanded access IND submissions received by FDA are for single patient INDs and single patient emergency IND submissions. Overall, 99% of all expanded access submissions are allowed to proceed, have been allowed to proceed by FDA. In summary, there is a need for balance. Treatment access must be balanced against the systematic collection of clinical data to characterize safety and effectiveness. Patient autonomy must be balanced against exposure to unreasonable risks and the potential for health fraud and potential exploitation of desperate patients. Individuals' needs must be balanced against societal needs. Remember, clinical trials are the best mechanism to provide evidence of safety and effectiveness for potential new treatments, and FDA approval for marketing is the most efficient means to make safe and effective treatments available to the greatest number of patients. Now I will turn the presentation over to Lieutenant Commander Wagner.
Thank you, Deb. Again, my name is Lieutenant Commander Lindsay Wagner. I'm an active duty pharmacist in the U.S. Public Health Service and a team leader in the Division of Drug Information in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. So some of my focus today will be on expanded access related to investigational drugs. My goal today is to provide you with knowledge of web resources you can refer back to later, just in case you can't recall 100% of the information that we present here today. A little over 4 months ago, in October 2017, updates were released to the guidance for industry titled Expanded Access to Investigational Drugs for Treatment Use, Questions and Answers. There are 3 important updates that I want to take some time to review. You can easily locate this guidance online by going to fda.gov, typing guidance in the search box, and using the guidance document search page to look up the keywords. There is also a link at the bottom right corner of this slide directly to the guidance. This will bring up 2 guidance documents when you do the search. This one shown here, and one on Form FDA 3926, the form Colleen will review for us next. I'm now going to cover each of these bullets in more detail in the following slides, so I'm going to just read them for you here. The 3 things I want to cover, the first is the waiver option for convening the full Institutional Review Board, or IRB, for review of single patient requests. The second is clarification around how adverse events are viewed by the FDA that occur during expanded access treatment. And the third are the 21st Century Cures Act requirements for industry. The waiver for full IRB review we'll review in detail now. So a major improvement to the IRB review and approval process was described in the October 2017 update. After the update in October 2017, the requirement for IRB review can be satisfied by obtaining concurrence from the IRB chairperson before treatment use begins. This can take the place of convening the full IRB. We are very pleased to be able to offer this option now that relieves some of the burden on physician sponsors and IRB committees. For emergency expanded access requests, IRB review is not required before the treatment is administered. This is necessary because of the emergent nature of these expanded access uses. There is a requirement to report use of the investigational drug in an emergency no later than 5 days after providing treatment, and FDA authorization prior to treatment is still required. But it's important to note that FDA authorization takes only minutes to hours to receive in an emergency situation. I want to go over the GAO report, or the Government Accountability Office. There was clarification that was provided in the October 2017 guidance in response to this report. And for individual patient expanded access, The regulations specify that at the conclusion of treatment, the sponsor must provide to FDA a written summary of the results of the expanded access use, and that includes adverse events. We heard not only from the GAO report that there was an area of confusion among industry and the public regarding how adverse event information is used by the FDA. So we provided clarification on this topic with the October 2017 updates. The take-home message to me is very clear, and it appears here in quotes lifted from the guidance. FDA is not aware of instances in which adverse event information from expanded access has prevented FDA from approving a drug. From a public health perspective, early identification of important adverse events is very beneficial. So for example, a relatively rare adverse event might be detected during expanded access use, or such use might contribute safety information for a population not exposed to the drug in clinical trials. FDA is not aware of instances in which adverse event information from expanded access has prevented us from approving a drug, and FDA reviewers of these adverse event data understand the context in which the expanded access use was permitted, and will evaluate any adverse event data obtained from an expanded access submission within that context. So to give you a little bit more data with this, we presented this on the slide. 2 cases in over 10,000 expanded access authorized requests had adverse events that led to a clinical hold, and those were later resolved. So the next thing I want to go over are 4 key reasons that were included in the Q&A guidance that we're going over. Specifically, this is in number 26, and they describe why it's extremely difficult for us to draw a causal link between a reported adverse event and the expanded access treatment. So here are those 4 key reasons. So FDA reviewers recognize that first, expanded access treatment, it generally occurs outside a controlled clinical trial setting. The second thing is that patients who receive a drug through expanded access, they might suffer from a more advanced stage of the disease or condition than patients who are participating in a clinical trial. Third, patients who receive a drug through expanded access, they may be receiving other therapies for their disease or condition at the same time as the drug they are receiving through expanded access. And finally, patients who receive a drug through expanded access, they may suffer from one or more comorbidities. So all of these factors, they all make it very difficult to link an expanded access treatment to a particular adverse event. Moreover, as we've shown, it's very rare for FDA to place an IND on clinical hold due to adverse events observed in expanded access treatment. So the 21st Century Cures Act is the last part of the guidance updates that we'll go over. And there's a section in the guidance that talks about what industry needs to do. So the 21st Century Cures Act requires sponsors to make their policy for evaluating and responding to expanded access requests publicly available. And it goes into detail about what that policy must include. So it must include contact information, procedures for how to make a request, the general criteria that's used to evaluate and respond to the request, the length of time that might be necessary to acknowledge the receipt of the request, and also a hyperlink or other reference to the clinical trial record, similar to clinicaltrials.gov. Now next, we're going to go through the Reagan-Udall Foundation's Navigator website and go through some of the resources that are offered there. This is the homepage of the Reagan-Udall Foundation's Navigator. The Reagan-Udall Foundation is an independent, not-for-profit organization that was created by Congress for the purpose of advancing regulatory science. You can see that resources are grouped primarily into 2 buckets here, for patients and caregivers, and for physicians. If you click on either side of this screen, you'll be greeted with a wealth of information describing the entire expanded access process from start to finish. You can scroll through these pages and receive a wonderful education on this topic. The development of the Navigator was a team effort led by the Reagan-Udall Foundation in collaboration with patient advocacy groups, the pharmaceutical industry, FDA, and others in the federal government. It's something we're really proud to have been a part of creating. I'm going to take some time to highlight a few of the many wonderful resources that are available from the Navigator that you can't find anywhere else. So the first is the company directory. We just talked about the 21st Century Cures Act that required sponsors to make their policy for evaluating and responding to expanded access requests publicly available. One way to satisfy this requirement is by contributing information to the Navigator's company directory. You can see here some of the company listings already in the directory. These are chosen at random by me to showcase the first listing, so please don't accuse me of favoritism to companies starting with the letter A. This is just to show you a glimpse of the Navigator. The next thing we're going to go to is the Resources tab. So the first resource might sound like a familiar topic to you. It is a guide for industry on those major changes that I just talked about that were put into place in October 2017. So if somebody wasn't able to attend this webinar today along with you, and they come to you with a question about the updates to the guidance later, this is a great resource that answers that question about what those updates were. The second resource that's here is a user guide for clinicaltrials.gov. And I'm sure many of you have used clinicaltrials.gov in the past, but there were recently several upgrades made to the site, and the search features have really improved. You might also have other colleagues or office staff that could help you in your practice by being able to effectively search clinicaltrials.gov for open and recruiting trials, and also established expanded access programs. So this user guide provides a wonderful step-by-step guide that's complete with screenshots and tips to make any user comfortable. Finally, contact information is provided as a resource page on the Navigator. This is a very short list of contacts, but it's a great condensed resource of the most important phone numbers and email addresses that gets you to the Division of Drug Information, my group, and the Office of Health and Constituent Affairs, Dr. Miller's group, that physicians and patients should contact with questions about expanded access. The next couple of resources I'm going to highlight are incredibly useful tools. So the first is questions to ask about clinical trials. Some of you might be experienced users of expanded access. Some oncologists, for example, might be familiar with looking up clinical trials for investigational drugs as options for their patients. But for many of you attending today, you probably haven't had to consider the questions that one should ask if they are considering participating in a clinical trial. So this resource really takes the guesswork out of this already very stressful situation by providing a list of questions that either you, the healthcare professional, or your patient might want to ask the clinical trial sponsor or principal investigator. And you can download this resource or you can easily print it. The next resource is also a list of questions, and they are for patients who can't participate in a clinical trial. And they're now looking at group and single patient expanded access as an option. These questions are written to patients to ask their physician, but to me they're just as useful for any healthcare professional involved in this decision with a patient to make sure that everything is carefully considered. And finally, we know that not everyone practicing in medicine is as enthusiastic about regulations as we are here at FDA. So this last resource will hopefully set your mind at ease knowing that you are aware of everything that's required of you in terms of reporting to FDA if you do become the sponsor of a single patient expanded access application for one of your patients. So now we'll move on to looking at the web resources that are available directly from the FDA. The easiest way to find these resources to me is to perform an internet search for FDA expanded access. Hopefully that'll be the easiest one to remember as well. When we click on that first link, the page that we receive is the FDA's expanded access homepage. And you'll see that buttons are offered here for patients, for physicians, and for industry. And those each connect you with the resources that are right just for you. The next website I want to point out to you has "For Physicians" in the title. This is a web resource about single patient expanded access to investigational drug products specifically. So we know from answering your calls and emails that many of you are exploring these resources for the first time when you encounter a patient who needs expanded access to an investigational drug. We also know that a lot of times the physician will fill out the form FDA 3926, and who actually calls us in the Division of Drug Information is the office staff, maybe a nurse who's working on the office staff, and they're wondering where to submit the form and what to do next. So wherever we can, we're trying to take the guesswork out of this process. So here on this page, you're provided with two important resources. One, if you are submitting an emergency request, which usually means you need the investigational drug to be given to the patient within a matter of hours, and one, if you are submitting a non-emergency request, which typically has a 30-day timeline until authorization. So first, we'll look closer at the emergency IND timeline. This timeline explains what is needed when and where it needs to go. So you'll see that for emergency requests, authorization can be given by FDA over the phone, and paperwork needs to follow in a certain time frame later. If you scroll down on the web page, this is a screenshot from lower down that describes the reporting requirements so that we can learn about the successes, the failures of the investigational treatment that was used in the emergency situation. Now, I said we were going to talk about non-emergency single-patient expanded access submissions as well. So this guide is for those submissions, those non-emergency submissions. And this describes a stepwise approach for anyone new to the submission process. It describes the 4 required steps to submit expanded access. So a letter of authorization, Form FDA 3926, IRB approval, and obtaining informed consent. And then it also describes the follow-up submissions that in some cases are optional and in some cases are required, like safety reports. We also simplified the follow-up reports by making Form FDA 3926 usable for each type of follow-up submission, in addition to the initial request. One form makes things a lot easier for everyone, and Colleen is going to walk you through exactly how to complete this simplified form. Finally, we recognize no amount of online resources can take the place of talking to a knowledgeable expert when you have questions. So contact information is provided. We handle emergency expanded access requests 24/7. You can reach us by phone. You can also reach us by email when it's not an emergency. If you do have an emergency, though, I urge you to call. Faxing or emailing in an emergency situation is just not as good as picking up the phone. Finally, if you're ready to submit your single patient expanded access request and you know the review division to which you are submitting, we don't want to stand in your way of contacting that group directly. So phone numbers are provided online and they're organized by office. You can see that at the bottom of this screenshot here. So thank you very much for your time spent learning about our important web resources. I'll now turn it over to the person I go to when I have questions about expanded access and need an expert opinion, Colleen LoCicero.
Thank you, Lindsay. And as Lindsay mentioned, I'm going to take you on a walk through Form FDA 3926, which is one of the forms that can be used to submit an application for individual patient expanded access. So Form FDA 3926 is a one-page form. Here's the front, and there's the back. And it was introduced in June of 2016, and it was introduced in an effort to streamline the process for physicians submitting individual or single-patient expanded access INDs. The form was then updated in October of 2017 to accommodate the option that Lindsay discussed to obtain IRB chair or designee concurrence in place of full IRB review. So now we'll start through the actual form itself. So fields 1 and 2 are to be completed for both original IND applications that are submitted using the form and follow-up submissions to existing expanded access IND applications. So these are ones that have been previously submitted. And field 1 asks for the patient's initials, and the physicians are asked to provide the initials rather than the full name to preserve confidentiality. And the second field is for date of submission. Field 3 is where the physician identifies which type of submission this is, either an initial individual patient expanded access IND application, in which case 3A is checked, and then fields 4 through 8 and fields 10 through 11 are completed, or a follow-up submission to an existing individual patient expanded access IND, and in that case 3B is checked, and then fields 8 through 11 are completed. Also in this section, the name of the investigational drug is to be provided and the physician's IND number. And the physician's IND number is the number provided to the physician who is seeking expanded access for his or her patient. It's given to them by FDA, and this is not the IND number for the pharmaceutical company's IND that they have for developing and marketing the drug. Field 4 is where the physician provides clinical information, and this is for original individual patient INDs only. The physician provides information with respect to the indication or disease or condition to be treated, and a brief clinical history of the patient that includes the patient's age, gender, weight, any allergies they may have, their diagnosis, prior therapy, their response to that prior therapy, and the reason for the request, including an explanation of why the patient lacks other therapeutic options. Field 5 is where the physician provides some more treatment information, and this is for original IND applications only. Here, the investigational drug name is provided again, along with the name of the company that will be supplying the drug to the physician, the FDA review division, if known, and the treatment plan for the patient that includes the dose, route, and schedule of administration of the investigational drug, the planned duration of treatment, and monitoring procedures that will be utilized. Also included in this section are any anticipated modifications to the treatment plan in the event of a toxicity. Field 6 is to be completed if attaching a LOA or letter of authorization from the company providing the drug to the physician. And this is a letter that grants FDA authorization to reference the pharmaceutical company's IND that FDA has in its archives in order to satisfy the application requirements for the physician's expanded access IND. For example, chemistry and manufacturing information about the investigational drug that the physician would not normally have. Now, if the company providing a drug has not submitted an IND to FDA, then the physician is encouraged to contact the FDA review division for advice on what other sources of information may satisfy the regulatory requirements. And a letter of authorization, field 6, need only be completed for original applications. Same is true for field 7, the physician's qualification statement, and that's to include the medical school that the physician attended, year of graduation, medical specialty, state medical license number, current employment, and job title. Alternatively, the physician may elect to just attach the first few pages of his or her CV if that contains the required information. Field 8, and this is to be completed for both original INDs and follow-up submissions, is where the physician provides his or her contact information. Field 9 is for where the patient identifies the type of follow-up submission. So this is only to be completed for when submitting a follow-up submission to an existing individual patient expanded access IND. And the submissions that may be provided are the initial written IND safety report, and that's a report of potential serious risk provided within 15 calendar days to the FDA, and then also that covers reports of unexpected fatal or life-threatening adverse reactions, and those are to be provided to FDA within 7 calendar days. The next option in the left column is a follow-up to a written IND safety report, and that's follow-up information to the initial safety report that I just mentioned, and that's to be submitted to FDA within 15 calendar days of receiving that information. Now, if the treatment goes on for greater than a year, then the physician is to submit an annual report, and that's a brief report of the summary of the treatment experience during that year, and it's to be submitted to FDA within 60 days of the anniversary date of when the IND went into effect. The next a box is for a summary of expanded access use. This is to be submitted to FDA after treatment is completed, and it's a summary of the treatment experience, including adverse effects. In the right column at the top is a change in treatment plan. That's pretty self-explanatory as to what type of submission that would be. The next is general correspondence, and that would be to notify FDA of, for example, administrative type changes, or if treatment was completed and the physician wished to withdraw the individual patient IND, it could be used for that. The next is response to FDA request for information, and that's pretty self-explanatory. And then the final box on the right-hand column is the response to clinical hold. Now, if FDA had not authorized treatment or expanded access when the original IND was submitted, because of some safety concern, that would be considered a clinical hold. And a response to a clinical hold would be the response by the physician that addresses the safety concern or concerns that FDA identified that would, if adequately satisfied, allow FDA to authorize treatment and allow treatment of the patient to begin at that point. Field 10A is the request for authorization to use Form FDA 3926. And by checking that box, the physician is authorized to use that form to meet all of the submission requirements for an individual patient expanded access IND. And then 10B is the box to check if requesting authorization to use the alternative IRB review procedures that Lindsay discussed. Finally, field 11 is the certification statement, and by signing that form, the physician agrees to not begin treatment until 30 days after FDA receives the application or on earlier notification from FDA. Agreement to obtain informed consent. The physician agrees to obtain IRB review and approval and to conduct the investigation in accordance with all other regulatory requirements. And in the case of emergency access, a commitment to to notify the IRB of the emergency treatment within 5 working days. So for an individual patient IND submitted using Form FDA 3926, it may be possible that it consists only of the completed form, the letter of authorization to reference the pharmaceutical company's existing IND, and the first few pages of the physician's CV if he or she elects to provide their qualifications in that way rather than completing Section 5 of the form. Form FDA 1572 is not required to be submitted with Form FDA 3926. Finally, some overall points to remember about submitting individual patient expanded access INDs using Form FDA 3926 is that this form is specifically for use by sponsor investigators or individual physicians, and this is not to be used by drug developers. Second, it's to be used for the submission of individual patient expanded access INDs, including those for emergency use, no other types of expanded access submissions. And finally, for sponsor investigators or physicians who are familiar with Form FDA 1571, which is the form that drug companies use to submit INDs for drugs that they are developing to market. If a physician has been using that form and is familiar with it, they can continue to do so. But it should be noted that if the physician wishes to get the authorization to obtain the IRB chair or designee concurrence in lieu of the full IRB approval, the physician must include a separate request because there's no option for this authorization that's built into Form FDA 1571 like there is for Form 3926. And then for more information on expanded access, our last slide here provides a website and some contact information.
Thank you, Deb, Colleen, and Lindsay. This concludes the presentation portion of our webinar. If you haven't already entered your questions in the Q&A box, please do so now. And for those joining us late, the slides and presentation for this webinar will be archived and will be available later this week on our webpage at www.fda.gov/DDI webinars. Now we will pause for a few minutes to review your questions. We'll return in about 5 minutes or so and answer a few of your questions that we have time for. We are at 2 p.m., so we will just take probably just a few questions, but we will pause now and review them. Thank you. Okay, thank you for your patience. We had a lot of great questions coming in. Because of the time constriction, since it's already 2:06, we will take about 4 or 5 questions. And the first one that we will answer is, the question is there such a thing as an emergency intermediate IND? I think not. Would you please confirm, clarify?
That's correct. There isn't. The emergency provision for expanded access applies only to individual patient emergency expanded access.
Thank you, Colleen. Next question. For annual reports, are the summary reporting requirements, for example, number of subjects, demographics of subjects, etc., also required as they are for INDs?
And the annual reporting requirements for expanded access INDs are the same as they are for non-expanded access INDs, to the extent that they are applicable to that expanded access program.
Okay. Thank you. Next question. Is there a way to search the database to see what has already been submitted approved for an individual and can be used by others, or so it can be converted to an intermediate?
So this is Lieutenant Commander Wagner. There's no online database for individual expanded access requests. That would be, proprietary information and confidential. But we do have clinicaltrials.gov that we went over, and the user guide that's on the Navigator website, and that does have screenshots of how to search for established expanded access programs, including treatment programs and some of those intermediate size programs as well.
Thank you, Lindsay. Unfortunately, this will be our last question. For expanded access, are they applied also to orphan drugs, or is there a specific process for orphan drugs?
The expanded access program is also available for rare diseases and orphan drugs. There are no special programs, especially just for orphan products.
Thank you, Deb. If you have questions that we did not have time to address today, please email them to our Division of Drug Information email address at druginfo@fda.hhs.gov for assistance. I'll repeat that email address again. It's druginfo@fda.hhs.gov. This does conclude our session for today. The FDA appreciates your participation in this webinar, and we hope that you will join us again in the future. Our next CE webinar is titled FDA's MedWatch Adverse Reporting Program, Opportunities to Collaborate, and will be held on March 13th, 2018 at 1 p.m. Please visit our webpage at www.fda.gov/DDI webinars for more information and to register. Thank you.